Finally, it is with great pleasure that I introduce Eavan Boland. Eavan is the Bella Mayberry and Eloise Mayberry Knapp Professor in the Humanities, Melvin and Bill Lane Director of Creative Writing at Stanford. She has written over 20 volumes of work, much of it exploring the lives of women in Ireland, and called in a recent documentary a great woman poet in the history of Irish poetry, an heiress of William Butler Yeats. Eavan has been a great friend to Larry and me, and incredibly generous over many years to teach and try to make me a better poet. Years ago, when I shared the history of women on our farm, Eavan encouraged me to tell their stories in this 200-year heritage of Twin Pines Farm. She generously offered to come today and read out of the book with me, and I am in her debt as a poet, a woman, and a friend. My understanding of this heritage began while we listened to stories about grandmothers around the dinner table. They were often running the farm when husbands and sons were at war, buried, preaching, selling milk, or inventions. At family reunions, children were often lined up according to height, and each asked down the line to recite the lineage of our family back generations. Nope, I'm out of here. There were artifacts like a black kettle, a Civil War uniform, a spinning wheel that all had stories to tell. The women especially took on human form in letters and diaries out of an old pine trunk. The men wrote about cows and weather, the women about children lost, the boredom of winter, the difficulties of farm life. Poetry was read, written, and recited at our family gatherings back through centuries, sometimes standing on hay bales. To quote Eavan, if women go to the poetic past, as I believe they should, then they will have the right to influence what is handed on in poetry, as well as the way it is handed on. I went to this past to hand on this heritage to my grandchildren. So we are each going to read a bit from various sections, and Eavan is going to start with an introduction about the first two grandmothers.
Well, first of all, let me say, that I'm just delighted and honored to be here. I mean, Larry and Nancy are dear friends of mine, but, Nancy and I connected as poets and friends over this really wonderful project. And from the very first minute, I could see what it meant to have this farm going back into her family and having the voices of women gone from it, but the marginalia left. The Irish monks used to write poems on parchment, but only in the margins. In the middle, they were just illustrating, but it's the margins that mattered. And here were these diaries and these beautiful, powerful connections to the past. And when you looked at this project that Nancy undertook with so much work and so much diligence and so much craft, you could see what it meant. So the first the first people I'm going to read from, and Nancy's going to read from, are these two women whose lives went past certain years. The first of them is called Rhoda Williams McCune. She lived from 1771 to 1868. She was born before the foundation of the American Republic and lived till after the Civil War. And so her life spanned this amount of time and event. And, her story, like so many stories, but untold, was just remarkable. She married in 1789, and some years later, with her husband, who was a man called Martin McCune, they walked from Rhode Island. They had a cart with two children, and they walked into upstate New York, where the farm would happen. They built a log cabin, and by hand they dug a well. And it's the well you see on the front of the book. And they had, God bless them, they must have had some Irish background, they had 15 children. 11 of those children did survive. She was a local midwife. Her father lived to 100. 2 sons, 4 grandsons fought in the Civil War, and she died in 97. And so on her gravestone is written, she did what she could. And Nancy's lovely first poem here is, about the interior monologue of this woman walking into this wilderness. Move me, wheel, from the sea and by the Hudson, through woods, fields. My hand on your rim, growling bellies, oxen smells, make my feet go with my prayers. Have I brought what I need for the world ahead? And who will ask for my stories? Will I find my snake root and sweet Sicily? Will the peonies survive? Will I find good water for a well? And the next was one of the children who died, and she calls that poem Sweet James. And even the title gives you that sense of the pageant of sorrow and power that these people lived without much voice for it. The tag above the poem, Nancy's really lovely poem, Tomorrow I'll pick stone and set my mind right, comes from her words. Sweet James. My nipples already hard, his milk gone, and the bruise of suckling, our bed empty. He was a fern, barely unfurled. Sun on his coffin, his grave dirt smells like a harrowed field, a split in the wood, and I almost see my boy under his small quilt. The air is full of wings and chimes of the church bell. I must get busy, stones, a patch of Johnny cakes, a walk to the well.
Thank you. So Roba was a cult figure in our family, and whenever somebody was starting to fall apart, she was always called upon in our family to get some of those Roba genes and get back to work. So one of the famous stories about her was finding a bear in her log cabin with her children. Roba finds a bear in her cabin. This morning, sod, spun earth, a green and singing space with pure air to drink. Yesterday, the black clouds like a chest of fur. Down at the creek, holes in the thick ice where something but nobody fell. Some movement in the cabin. My arms still shake after his exit, the panting giant. Swing my broom, shout to Martin to save the cows, run, yell to the children to hide, breathe as if I am finished and Satan himself is after me. In and out of the house all day, watch the trees, look for his return. Tonight, a moon claws the dark. So one of the other notable things that Eavan mentioned was that because she had so many children and she lived to be 98, she had grandchildren, and when the Civil War came, she sent a lot of her sons and grandsons to war. And there were letters there of her writing to others about the fact that some were deserting. And one of the lines out of the letters was, I think these diseases arise from a lack of pluck. Because this was a Roba in a letter to her sister Mercy in 1862. One by one, they leave whistling. 5 loads of soldiers left for camp at Mohawk today to be mustered. I cannot speak without crying, and so I stayed home. More news of the bloody fight, terrible exposure, dysentery. I'm afraid to open letters. Many plead they are ill and can't enlist. They will not bleed.
The 15th child of Roba and Martin McCune was called Elizabeth McCune Young. She was born in 1816 and she died in 1891. And you know, today we have a much better sense of what it means to have the private echoes out of a public occasion. I think back in that time, it was the public voices that prevailed. But when you look back and you see the people on the margins of those events, and yet hugely involved in them through their losses, then you see a side of history. If you call it the distaff side of history, fine, but it's one of the truest faces of history. They had two children, Floyd and Helen, and it is Floyd, her son, who dies in the Civil War. She was a member of the abolitionist movement, and in 1880, they traveled to California, her husband and herself, and they died within a year, and they are buried in the churchyard there. There's a little tag, please God, leave a trace. How careful I have been not to picture war. Now it's all I can see. The extraordinary losses that happened at that time. She wrote in a letter to her cousin, Sophie, 1861, our boys are cold in the fields, no bandages, no medicine, hardtack, rancid water, and dysentery. And this poem is called War Talk. Tomorrow David leaves for Albany for the train south. We sit tense across the table, Johnny cakes and syrup between us, onions frying hard. How I weep with them. Mother's fingers roll dough and drop sugary balls in lard, but sweet smells don't decrease the talk of guns and Lincoln's generals. Our boy molds in his tent, cooks mice. I am sick of gunshot. Target practice in the woods while the maples shudder. And then she has one poem called Mother, about her mother. And she writes to her cousin Sophie again, Mother is still with us, but how long? 1868, almost the year of her mother's death. War, mud, cold, hunger, blood. She wore brown clothing, she ate spongy potatoes, she foraged the woods for pie plant and cowslips, and dug a well and chased a bear from our cabin. She called on God Almighty for help with our calves and winter wheat. She yelled at Satan over the dead cow and war. I hope her peonies will bloom again this spring.
So one of the things that our grandkids like to do when they go back to the farm is get the uniform out that has the bullet hole through the chest and put it on or look at it. And so the story that happened where my grandfather, when they found out that their son was wounded, took a horse and buggy down to Albany, a train to Virginia, found another horse and buggy, went through the enemy lines, found his son buried, who had just passed away, dug him up, put him in a pickle barrel, brought him home, and buried him in the churchyard. And so we have all these artifacts from him, his canteen and so forth, and the story about how they got him home. So this is the ache of everything. I must write how it was, how straight he walked down the road with his new canteen and musket, his letters of boredom wrought a bloodied creek. His father brought him back in a pickle barrel, my only son, we needed him home. Outside, chimney smoke fades in the early hours, my stropped heart by the well and wormed fence with the ache of everything. Thunder starts, time will come when I can sleep. Blessed rain, but so little erased the rush and suck of water. And so, maybe one more of that, or
Sure.
And then Elizabeth lived in her 80s too, and she and her husband Martin, after their only son was gone, they stayed on the farm and kept it. And she wrote often to her daughter Helen, who was then living in Boston and just saying, how can they keep going on? But this was a letter that she wrote where she said, I must not let my feelings rise above my reason. If I did, I should think I might not live long. Sifted yolks, smell of burned feathers, 6 hens plucked and in their prisons, cider worked enough, sun swirling on the laundry line. What are we doing, we two alone? We pick stone year after year, bake as if the house were full, Floyd gone, a phantom limb. The names in this house will change, and ours will move to the churchyard. Fingers will rub my headstone. But I give myself a good lungful of October air and reason, and write this letter with what light is left in one last stub of candle. And she writes, that's all I know. God help us.
You know, there's one beautiful last poem in the last section of that account of her life. It reminds you of how much people's lives were full of departures that were unrecorded, except in the brief letters they wrote, in the small kind of Morse code of the suffering of the day. This poem is called Winter Coming, and it's when Elizabeth writes to her daughter Helen, and she writes to her, she's going back to Boston. She's left Twin Pines, she has the grandchildren with her, and she's going back in 1899. She has a note that said, I dreamed of sweet Laura in my arms. It makes me want to see her. I can hardly keep the tears back. This is the poem. Storm is coming, but the tubs are full. One wash, the other butter for you on the next train. Tell the children. I baked pies, 3 mince, 3 apple, and a turnover. Fried a pan of cakes, 65 sugar cookies, and bread rising for tomorrow. We took the cider barrel to the cellar, just worked enough to be good, and I watched the children sitting straight backed on the train. Let them go.
So the next, my great-grandmother, Helen, was an extraordinary woman. She was born with a severe hearing loss and only 2 fingers on her left hand, and yet she was an accomplished pianist, a seamstress, she raised 4 children, and often ran the farm. At 16, when she lost her brother Floyd in the Civil War, she married an itinerant preacher from England who was ostracized from the church because he became a follower of Charles Darwin. And so they moved from place to place. And she was in London and Paris during World War I when it broke out, and lived through the Depression until she died in her late 90s at 1938. The stories and letters about her reveal a woman who could squeeze a penny, and she single-handedly ran Twin Pines for many years and is buried in the churchyard back there. So I just wanted to start with a lot of her words from her journals are poetry themselves. And I started to write poems about them, and I thought, I'm not going to change a thing. They're all, the poems are in her words. But one of the things that happened was that she lost her daughter to pneumonia. And so this poem called Gravity, she started out her diary with this entry. It was a beautiful morning. How can I live without my Florence? The sky was gray flannel. Twigs and a sparrow rushed along by the brilliant gale. From the outside, I was the figure crouched over a bed, holding a dove. Her breath burned red in the room. Her end was as bright and new as feathered gold. Then I was the woman unable to stand. And one more. As I said, she was known for her economy, and one of her favorite things was to cook woodchuck for dinner. So this is The devil. Woodchuck again for dinner. I hope this one's the devil who's been digging underneath the porch. Tisk tisk, God forgive my evil chuckle when they brought it in my kitchen, dark and delicious.
This poem is called, maybe appropriately, Hunger. And it's, she has a note, a letter to her mother from Whitestone Academy in 1863. She says, "Oh, for apples, fried cake, pies, and cheese." And this is the poem. "Dear Mama, only bread, butter, applesauce for dinner here. Last night I got 6 cookies for 3 cents. Soon we will be about starved. I could eat a bushel of apples if I were home. Saturday and Sunday are the longest days. I can never stay here 5 more weeks. Bring me medicine for my hearing. I am so tired of living here. I can picture you at the window where you stand, 5 o'clock, and I hear the bell for dinner."
I think we'll move on to the next one.
Yes.
So the last grandmother poem is about my grandmother, Hope Huxtable. She married my grandfather when they lived in Boston, and she came from a very genteel environment in Boston. And my grandfather was singing in the Boston Opera, and so she thought this was a man who was going to live that life of arts in Boston. And the next thing she knows, they're living on the farm and with no running water and no indoor plumbing and desperate poverty. So she also died very early from complications in childbirth. And but the few letters that remain, she is, her spirit, her fun-loving ways come through. And this was one that she wrote to Arthur when he was off singing. The dancing season. I went out and danced till 1:30 a.m. and I loved to dance. I had more fun and I went to bed with no precious to cuddle up to. June at last, and the Grange gave a party. In my sleep, I asked you to let me go dancing. I said to myself, 1 week more and he will be home. I left the hearthstone and the laundry, mayflies, water to be drawn. I left the whey draining in the sink. I know the look of you beside me on my bed, but I could not miss a dancing party and be home alone. And then just the other poem. This is as she's about to go in for her operation, Certainty, and she writes, my grandparents, "Dear Father and Mother Huxtable, I would by far rather go through an operation, even though a serious one, than to drag around. Because I was bedbound all morning, the windows covered, I drew outlines on the bed sheets with my fingertips, wrote letters. I could hear the men draw the second cutting. Ma worked the old ringer, telling the boys to keep the noise down by the stairs. What I am certain of tonight, curled under Arthur's snores. Let it happen, whatever is next. Let there be life and death."
You know, the way that Nancy framed these lives is really out of her sense of how powerful the lives were that were lived on the farm. And, you know, that in itself is an enormous gift in poetry. It is not all that usual that people are able to go to the voices that have not been heard and make the voices heard through their faith in them and through their sense. I hope to steal a poem from you, and maybe you can read the one beside it. These are 2 poems at the beginning of this book, which really frame the intent and the power of the book itself. The first is called In the Attic. The second is Lifting My Granddaughter to the Well, which you'll read. But here is In the Attic. It's that sense of what do you do with these inheritances? You know, I come from a country where people wrote emigrant letters and got them back or didn't get them back. And, you know, so many people had a sense of those lives perishing even as they were written. And here, you know, the powerful dignified, important lives are made clear. And this is the poet in the attic. A pine trunk sits under cobwebs and mouse droppings. Words from a dipped pen, frayed diaries, yellowed letters, lines written over lines to save paper. Old words, strop, the privy, pickets, pipe plant. A cross stitched cloth under the lid keeps the silence clean. I never think of them without their flesh. Helen's clouded eyes, a daughter's diseased leg buried under the rose bush, or sharp ribs at the end of a long winter. I pick fieldstone, or I walk beside Roba, or work in a hot kitchen, making food for men in the field. But who dug the well for the cabin? Who watched the 1860 eclipse while DG boiled sap? Who listened to Grandpa James's sermons, sweeping earth of sin, or folded Floyd's bullet-ridden uniform? What did Aunt Laura write to Eleanor Roosevelt? Sometimes I stand watching my grandmother's lives like a midwife in the boarding room. But the silence is never silent. At times I hear the strangest noise, as if the dead could clap, and then I breathe and listen to a branch brush the dormer pane.
And then the moment when I said to myself, I've got to write some of this down, was when I took my granddaughter Anna back to the farm for the first time when she was 2, and I lifted her to the well that you see on the front cover, and I watched her look at her face, and I thought, this is something I have to start. Lifting my granddaughter to the well, a soft fold over the edge, pink shoes lifted, her image buoyant in the water below. She stares into the cylindrical dark, past moss and mottled snails pulled back in their casings. Her face disappears in the bucket splash, there and then not. Now the earth's sweet liquid brims, spills and falls back on the grass, circles to the roots, through the roots to the well, the river, and the bass pond. So in the few minutes we have left, I wanted to just read a little bit about growing up in this incredible place that you see over there in the picture, and living in a place that's been there for 200 years and all the history that's in it and hearing the stories. And my mother moved there with my dad in 1940, and even though she grew up in the area, she, I don't think, envisioned herself as a farm wife. And when she first moved there, she tells the story about her first day arriving. Twin Pines Farmhouse, 1940. You stepped into the dark kitchen and realized the mound in the middle of the floor was a heap of cold ash. The house forgotten, stripped clean, including the wood stove. A leaf, they left the ash to tell you where to cook. You must have known then days, years would disappear in a haze of hard work. You would set your tables with zinnias, candles, and cloth napkins. Though flies feasted on the day's dinner, the rooms washed in rose and daisy wallpapers. You breathed walls and floorboards back to life, dared to imagine beauty, spent hours weeding to find the light inside peonies. Sometime after, a field would be named for you, where on a summer day you drove a tractor topless. But this house would never be called Adeline's. Just your years of prayer, sweat, singing, and admonition to your daughters, never marry a farmer. So I was going to read another one, what it's like to grow up there. And it's very different now, where you have to be careful when you let kids out the door. Then you were just sent out the door, or it wasn't noticed that you weren't there. And my sister Sue is here, so she understands. But this This was one episode. To survive there was no small feat. A toddler finds her way out the farmhouse door, looking for the horse who pulls the wagons. The sun fixed overhead. Bob, the hired man, ferries hay from field to barn. He trusts the sky. He fails to see her in the furrow of her father's field, freshly plowed. The wheel of his empty wagon going forward precisely over the top of the mounds and over her body, like a seed planted in fertile soil. They are a speck, but it turns in the corner of his eye, a change in the light, a cry. A few tears, dirt falls from gnarled fingers as he checks her, yet only a small fragment of rib sticks strangely from her chest. Bob's voice, I'm sorry, I didn't see her," in that crestfallen way one is sorry for not catching a fledgling in first flight. She still sees old Bob at funerals, gas stations, and the feed store. Always flusters, he bellows. "How you doing after I ran over you?" Strange how her hand goes quickly to her chest.
You know, what is never sentimentalized in the book is that the farm is both the incredibly rich and the incredibly difficult context of the text of the lives that are lived there. And this lovely poem is called Worry. And, you know, the tag is from Adeline in a letter to her daughter, Nancy, who's here. And it said, "Worrying never stops. Why is it never on the list of why not to have children?" And here's the poem. Her back was broken by worry. The walls of her private room so choked with questions on sleepless nights. The farm, Jim's health, no money, no sons, children in creeks, trees, on barn roofs, how many cows to sell for college and weddings. And each morning there began a tiny song, trying to turn to praise. Faith came with a small evidence of things, and still now grandchildren, in a mixed-up world, in a rush to end their brief childhoods. But tonight, a new moon leaps over the paint-brushed hills, and she looks to them for help.
Pardon me? Yes, that sounds great.
Yeah.
So I just want to read one more, or two more rather. One is when we sold the farm to a cousin after my dad died. This was my mother's last hours there, walking past the farm where I once lived. The truck carrying Mom's things up the hill spilled pots and bedboards, items worth saving after Dad died. The front door stood propped open. No more worries about flies in the house. By evening, we were finished after weeks of discarding vacuums, his neckties, broken chairs, packing her rolling pin, peonies, a trunk of letters. She picked up her life and moved on. Mother spent the last hour upstairs alone in their bedroom. Slow as time, she placed a hand on the stair wall. Years to walk past as she came down, her hand sliding over the rose-covered paper. "Goodbye, old walls," she said, over and over, her face a thin sheet. Someone else owned this now. That was among the best lessons she ever gave me. To hold the thoughts that carry you down the stairs. Watch a leaf falling in spirals even though winter is coming. Love the house, intricately patterned with memory, still rising into blue sky. And then the last poem I want to read is for Larry. 1 minute more. A man and a woman sit after dinner, stare at the sun's reach over oak and crusted hills, the long light on green lawn. They drink wine and talk of those not seen in years, of hope and not despair. The dusk around them holds itself taut as robins search for their evening meal. "Let's not go in yet," he begs. 1 minute more. Thank you so much.
That's a lovely last
Thank you all. So, thank you guys. So there's wine and cheese. There's wine and cheese, and you know, I'll ring the bell, but please stay, and so wonderful of you all to come. I just really am grateful, and especially to Eavan.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Are you ringing that bell?
Shall I ring the bell?
That was lovely. That's a lovely last one.
Well, I wonder.
Yeah.
Read that one.
You know, I just know it'll come right for Larry, you know.
I think, we've never give up hope. But,
No.
you know, there's so many things that are happening. now.
Otherwise, we'll have to go and get Bob, though. I know.
I think it is. It could have been entitled